Time to welcome science commentator David Haywood, standing by in Christchurch. Great to talk to you.
Yes, and you, Catherine, as always.
And we begin with?
We're going to talk about asexuality today. Now, this is not the asexuality that most people will be familiar with, which is the kind that you see in amoebas, that is reproduction without the involvement of another individual. This is asexuality in mammals. So this is mammals that are physically capable of reproducing, but from a behavioural point of view, they're just simply not sexual at all. And this, of course, humans are a mammal, so this is something that also occurs in mammals. And it was something I didn't even know that this existed until a couple of years ago, and I actually came into contact with an individual who identified themselves as asexual. And I thought this was going to be tremendously interesting for people in New Zealand, because it would be something they wouldn't have heard of. But just before I came on the air, I did a search. I just want to check out one final fact, and I discovered...
You found our website.
Well, it's been a plot line on Shortland Street, apparently.
Oh, goodness. Well, everyone knows about
it.
We've done interviews on it too, actually.
Oh, have you really?
Interview quite a long time ago now.
I searched your website, but I didn't find anything.
I think it was probably too long ago, and there's actually an association, I think, in New Zealand. Yeah.
Okay. Oh well, I want to build on the basic science that's been given in Shortland Street, and also in your on your earlier
very
interviews.
Basic science in Shorty Street, I imagine. What's where are you coming at it from then?
Well, I mean, I guess the first thing is to understand what asexuality is. So this is the idea that when most people think about human sexuality, they would imagine a continuum with homosexual at one end, heterosexual at the other, and bisexual dead in the middle. And then I guess at right angles to that would be another continuum that might run from hypersexual to hyposexual. So from
libido. Yeah,
very, very high sexual drive to a very, very low sexual drive. And you would imagine, or at least I would have, that all of humanity would be somewhere on that in the definition of that plane. But asexuals aren't. So there's a difference between having a low sexual drive and being asexual. So, somebody with a low sexual drive might look at Catherine Ryan and say,
give it a miss.
She's a very attractive woman, but I'm too exhausted at the moment. But asexuals wouldn't have that initial stage of saying, they wouldn't be able to necessarily tell that it might be something they could learn, but instinctively they wouldn't have been able to evaluate. A sexual attraction really wouldn't mean anything to them.
Please use me less often in examples.
Okay. So it's quite different from celibacy or abstinence, where there's a choice involved.
What about the science? Has much science been done on it?
Not a great deal, but a little bit has been done, and there's been some animal studies done, actually primarily on sheep, funnily enough. So you wonder if there's maybe that's the New Zealand connection, but. Yeah, and there's been 3 different studies that have come up with about the same numbers, which is in male sheep, about 2 to 3% of male sheep were found to be asexual. So this is something that occurs completely ordinarily in nature. And that's actually something I should mention. It's not a disorder, it's just another form of human behaviour that is completely normal within the realm of the whole of human, or indeed mammalian behaviour.
Has any such study been done among humans?
Well, if you read about the details of the sheep study, you couldn't actually do that same sort of study on humans. Although it would be cool to try.
I'm reluctant to ask what they've done to the sheep.
The mind boggles. But of course, you can ask people about their sexual behaviour, but naturally enough, they don't necessarily tell you the truth. And so, there have been a couple of studies done, and they've actually found quite different numbers, but the range isn't radically different. So at the low end, about 1% of the human population being asexual, at the high end, about 3%. So, I mean, that's a big difference, but it's in neither cases is it really huge.
And again, we're not talking about celibacy, as you say, or decisions made for other reasons. These are people who say what of themselves? That they simply have no motivation or interest, or what? Yeah,
it's something that they were born with, and they were born like that, and they've always been like that. And presumably this is the same as has been observed in these animal trials. That there's no. I mean, I don't think it's ever suggested that the animals have experienced some terrible experience which has put them off sexual behaviour. It's simply just a characteristic of their behaviour.
You're talking today about the Shaker movement. I've never heard of them. Who are they?
Oh, haven't you heard of the Shakers?
I've heard of the Quakers.
Oh, the Shakers that actually comes from the Shakers, from the Quakers. They were known as the Shaking Quakers initially, and so and they have these very, very large dances, and they would kind of get into a sort of religious fervour, and they'd be doing this thing called speaking in tongues, which is kind of babbling, and then they'd kind of go into convulsions, shaking convulsions, and literally kind of fall over. And this was a movement that came in the 1700s from the UK, and it really hit its stride in the US. It was an evangelizing movement, attracted a tremendous, tens of thousands of converts. But the real point of differentiation between them and other religions was the Shakers said no sex. So now, when they say no sex, it's not like in Catholicism or Greek Orthodox or the Hare Krishnas, where they prohibit sex except in order to have children in those religions. The Shakers were like, no sex at all. And they're also different because they're not, they're in just a new religion that had to evangelize to get supporters. And so I always thought, this has got to be the toughest religious sell ever. No sex, join our religion and you'll never have sex again. And there's no possibility of having it. And yet, if you think that there is a proportion of the population who are asexual, who don't have sexual awareness or sexual feelings, then that would actually be something that they could really respond to. And the numbers of Shaker converts and the proportion of asexuals in the population is about, it doesn't defy belief. And it's, that's certainly
It's an interesting theory. It's a bit of a leap. I mean, if you look at the Catholicism, say, which says priests shall be celibate, yet they're not presumed to lack sexual drives. So it's, I would, as I say, I make that distinction between the Shakers because they were evangelizing. They went, in Catholicism, which has built up over a long time, there is a sort of education, or one could say indoctrination as well. And so that it's something that's normalized in people who are raised within that religion. They would know about celibate priests their whole life. It's not something that somebody suddenly says to them, hey, you could be celibate, and they're like, yay, I'll do it. But even so, in that, with the celibacy of the priesthood, one could imagine that you would have a tremendous advantage in terms of being able to conform if you're an asexual. That might be something that is very interesting to asexuals. And of course, this is something that's very, very difficult to do research on at all. Are you just a very, very holy person, or are you asexual? Well, I'm sure some of the asexuals out there will be saying we don't have any particular desire to run off and join a religious movement either. No,
but there wasn't, in a lot of ways. Not necessarily now, but 100 years ago or more, your options were kind of limited because there was, the world was designed around sexual people, sexual behaviour, and if you didn't want to engage in that, if you didn't want to be, as some of when you read these case studies of asexual people when they've been in relationships and how unhappy they have been. Trying to conform into society, that certainly something like the priesthood may well be an attractive option.
Interesting theory that you postulate.
This can only be speculation, but it's interesting. It's a sort of an interesting topic to speculate about. And there's one other point that I want to make because I sense that you're about to
launch into the next subject. Yes.
Yeah. But it's the economic success. The Shakers became a tremendously rich organisation. They were, on an individual basis, almost all of them millionaires. And the same if you look at the celibate priesthoods, the monasteries, the medieval monasteries, they all became terribly, terribly rich. And that gives you a clue to the evolutionary driver. It seems like what would be the evolutionary basis for asexuality? The whole point of life is to reproduce, and there seems on the face of it to be no possible evolutionary point in being asexual and not reproducing. But the idea is that when you take a genetic population in a net sense, it may be productive for a section of that population not to breed, but rather to use their energies in helping their relatives breed. So in other words, their genes are passed on not directly by themselves, but by virtue of the fact that they share genes with their relatives. The genes that they share with their relatives are passed on. And, obviously the extreme example of that is something like ants or bees, but they're also mammalian examples.
I was going to mention dinkies, but never mind. They are having sinks, presumably. Perhaps not very much, who knows. Your second subject today, and it is literally launch into it, is space travel again. What's the latest on this one?
Well, this is a different aspect of space travel. And in fact, this is something that there is a segue here from asexuality to space travel, which is this is a point that I want to raise with you. Whenever people interview astronauts, they always ask, "What do you do for the lavatory in space?" And I think it's very, very well known. But the question that plagues me far more is, what do you do in terms of sex in space? Because you're there in your space station with the attractive chap astronauts and attractive chapette astronauts, and you're locked together in this small room for months and months, and nobody ever asked that question.
And you're stitched up from head to toe in that white suit thing.
Possibly very attractive to some people, yes. and you know, does NASA give them drugs? What do they do? And I think next time you have an astronaut on, I want that question asked and answered.
You're
please.
not going to postulate that.
No.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because in the book we were talking about recently, Sebastian Young's book about soldiers at war, it's often one thing I've wondered why men would want to go away for months and years and be away from women, but be away from sex with women. And it was he was very frank about how they manage things, shall we say. I'm not going to speculate how they manage things in space.
Yeah, well, that's a much more confined space.
The same way everyone does, I guess. When anyway, your space topic is, or is that it?
Yeah, that would be enough. And yeah, it's going to be we're going to be a bit tight here. But so this is a group of companies called collectively New Space, and this is differentiated from Old Space. Old Space would be something like the Space Shuttle, which is being retired next year. And the idea behind the Space Shuttle is they're going to replace it with nothing. So NASA did have this system called the Constellation Launch System, which they cancelled, and now they have nothing to replace the Space Shuttle. And future US manned launches are going to contract out to the Russian Federal Space Agency to launch astronauts on their Soyuz vehicles. And so obviously, from NASA's point of view, this isn't a great idea to be giving billions of dollars to the Russians. And so they're encouraging private companies to fill that void. And this is very similar in a way to what happened in the aeronautical industry in the 20s and 30s, when you had these sort of big companies forming to manufacture aeroplanes. In that, and Howard Hughes is the absolute prime example of this. He was a guy, he was already a multimillionaire in the oil industry, and he managed to get a competitive advantage because he didn't have to raise capital in the normal way from lots of shareholders or anything like that. He was already I think almost a billionaire by that stage. He just poured his own money into this, and he was able to do great things. And the thing that links these new space companies is that they've all been started, or nearly all of them, by .com entrepreneurs. These people who have become trillionaires from something or other .com, and now they've decided, whoa, too much money, we're going to spend it in the space industry. And so there's about six companies that have come up. This is people like Jeff Bezos, who runs this little online company called Amazon.com. There's the guy who designed the Doom and Quake programs. There's people from Intel. There's people from Microsoft. And there's a really interesting company called SpaceX, which has been founded by one of the people from PayPal, Elon Musk, who's this real Howard Hughes figure. And they've just like a month or so ago, actually been the first privately funded company to launch something into space.
And that's SpaceX, not SpaceX, to keep your theme going. And I actually thought Richard Branch and Virgin Atlantic, to keep the theme going, we're having a look at this as well.
No, they're suborbital, actually. So they're not into
right out
orbit.
of space.
Yeah, out all the way.
Good talking to you. David Haywood, our science correspondent, in the Christchurch studio, wrapping up our show for the day.